Hello, everyone. A very good evening to each and every one of you. It is wonderful to see you joining us this evening. It's good to see all your faces. You've braved the weather and you've been able to join us. So welcome for our masterclass this evening. My name is Victoria Mwema. I am a course instructor here at Shamiri Academy. At the Academy, we are pioneering learning for the next generation of mental health caregivers, both here in Kenya and beyond. So in this masterclass this evening, we are joined by Dr. Marc Hauser. And before I tell you about Dr. Marc, I will tell you about the Academy. So through the Academy, we are pioneering mental health learning and training that inspires and equips the next generation of mental health caregivers here, as well as outside of Kenya. And we are just getting started launching our courses. I'll be telling you about an exciting gift that you will get for having attended the masterclass this evening. So we have a course that is already up called How to Help Children with Trauma. But we are also having other developments coming up. So for today's session, we are lucky to be joined by Dr. Marc Hauser, who will be walking us through a session on how we can help children with socio-emotional learning challenges, help them to learn in school and also beyond school. So karibu sana, Dr. Marc. He brings over 30 years of experience as an educator and a research scientist. His prolific research includes over 300 published papers and 7 books, which have focused on how the brain evolves, develops, and how the brain is altered by damage and neurodevelopmental disorders. This also emphasizes on the processes of learning and decision-making, as well as the impact of traumatic experiences on development. So welcome, Dr. Marc.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you all for coming tonight. I know it's not very pleasant out there, but hopefully you stay dry. I want to start today's presentation with a personal story. I know that many of you are teachers or you're educators in some way. You're working with children, youth, young, older. And I thought it'd be important to start with a personal story of an experience I had, which I think will set the stage for the rest of the evening. This is a young man I met when he was about 8 years old, so not a young man, but a boy. And I've known him now for about 10 years. When I first met him, and his name is CJ, it was in a class of children with social emotional disabilities of some kind. And as you will learn further tonight, social emotional challenges can come from many different causes. So I didn't know anything about CJ's history at the time, but the class was a class on critical thinking. And in this class, which you'll also learn more about later tonight, the idea was that for many children with social emotional challenges, they're often very impulsive with their actions, their decisions, their speaking. So rather than calming the brain down and thinking through things, they just kind of react. So I thought it'd be important to start off with something kind of easy that I thought that everybody would have an opinion on. And so I started with this question. This is a classroom of about 10 children, all about the same age, 8 to 9 years old. Can you tell me something that you think is similar between humans and other species? And they all immediately raised their hands and they were answering with lots of different ideas about similarities. And that was good because I was a new teacher to them, a new person to them. I'd never met them before. And yet they were very quick and eager to respond. And that's good, right? Good for a teacher. So then came the second question. And the second question was, can you tell me something that is unique about humans? And this one little boy, CJ, who seemed to be just looking out the window and looking around but not paying attention to me, raised his hand while not looking at me. And I said, yes, CJ. And his answer was sentience. And I said, I'm sorry, but did you say sentience or sentence? At that point, CJ flipped his desk over, And I won't give you the actual swears that came out of his mouth, but he said, "What the bleep, Mark? Why would I say sentence? That's not even an answer to the question." So I said, knowing how to calm him down, "I'm so sorry. You know, I'm old and my hearing is really bad. I'm sorry I misheard you. So you said sentience. Amazing." So I then asked the class, including the teachers, does anybody know what sentience is? And I'll ask you that question. Can anybody tell me what sentience is? What is sentience? Anybody know? Well, you're not alone. No one in the class knew either. So I said, "CJ, can you tell me what sentience is?" And of course, being a child with social emotional difficulties, he said, "Why? Can't you tell us?" I said, "Well, I definitely can, but I'd like you to explain it in your words." So he rolls his eyes and he says, "Well, sentience is kind of like, the experience of experiencing. It's kind of having an experience of feelings. And I'm pretty good at maybe knowing what my feelings are like, but I can't really know what your feelings are like because you're different than me." I said, that's really good. That's a really good definition of sentience. And I said, "Where did you learn about this?" He said, "I do a lot of YouTube, and on YouTube I've heard these lectures. Lectures? I said, I don't know if they're philosophers or psychologists or maybe they're biologists, but they're this guy named Steven Pinker and Dan Dennett and Ned Block. And he's listing out these people who are really distinguished philosophers, scientists, and biologists." I'm like, my jaw dropped. And he says, "What, haven't you read those guys?" I'm like, "Yeah, I have, and some of them are my good friends, actually." He goes, "They're your friends?" I said, yeah. We'll have to talk about that sometime. All right. I tell this story because CJ, as I soon learned, lives in a trailer in the United States that's not much wider than this room, with 3 brothers, a mother who is severely depressed, and about 6 cats. CJ's been living like this for his entire childhood. His brothers are all older than him. CJ grew up with extreme neglect and poverty, and yet somehow that brain made it through resilience of some kind. I tell this story because it's an example of how childhood traumatic experiences, in this case in the form of neglect, can have an impact on social emotional issues, which CJ had a bundle of. Real problems with attachment, real problems with certain kinds of learning. And yet, somehow, this kid had a magical brain. Now, amazingly, fast forward to today, CJ is about 17, and he's in high school, and he wrote me a letter saying that he was so appreciative of one person believing in him. And that's what it took. So that's another piece of this, which is people need people who believe in them. And he's an example of that. Okay. You can see yet again, tears to my eyes. Can't help it. Okay, so here's the roadmap for today. And today, some of you I can see familiar faces. I'm delighted to see you again. Those who are online, of course, I can't see you. But hopefully some of the same faces are here today too. Today is not all about childhood trauma, which is what the last Masterclass was about, but more about social emotional challenges more generally, some of their root causes, and in particular, what we can do about it. So this is really the more proactive aspect of it. But here's the roadmap for today. We are going to start with the nature of social emotional processes. What do we mean by social emotional? What are those things? Okay. We'll then start talking about strategies, and the first set will be about emotional awareness. How can we bring greater awareness to individuals who have social emotional difficulties so that they can become more aware of what's going on. Secondly, we'll talk about self-regulation strategies. For many children with social emotional difficulties, part of the problem is they're often emotionally dysregulated and they have very poor self-regulation strategies. So what can we do to build those? Third is perspective taking. Again, for many children, and by the way, the focus here is on youth and children, but you will soon see that many of these strategies are equally good for adults with poor emotional awareness, self-regulation, and perspective taking. And the reason why I mention this is because for many who have social emotional challenges that began in childhood, because they were never addressed, they're now adults with social emotional challenges, okay? And then lastly, we'll talk about critical thinking strategies. And this is something for those of you who are teachers, you're probably already doing things about critical thinking because that's part of the curriculum. But here what I want to share with you is that there are certain critical thinking strategies that are ideally suited for children who are challenged by social emotional issues because they have impatient minds and we want to give them patient minds. Because what critical thinking ultimately is being patient with information. It's not acting on it immediately. It's going, I wonder if that's true. I wonder what you're assuming, right? But if you're impulsive, you don't ask those questions. So critical thinking is the art of working your way through information. So that's where we're going to go. Okay, so this is going to be a very, very short course on social emotional processes. For those of you who are interested in the certificate course, there's a lot more there, and there's a lot more where this came from. So I want you to imagine a classroom, and I'm going to give you a visual for this. But I want to, for those of you who are teachers or you're educators who are working with individuals and trying to teach them something, I want you to imagine a classroom or a group of people that you're working with and talking to them, okay? Now, in this classroom, it looks pretty good, like the kids are all kind of oriented towards this very animated teacher who's teaching them about English and how do you sound things out, and they all look pretty good, right? They're all kind of focused in some ways up here. But I'm going to give you a sense of what's going on in some of their heads or with their behavior that from the back we may not see. So this little guy is looking over here, is going, wow, she's pretty. And he hasn't heard a word of what the teacher just said. Because he's going, wow. Okay? Kid in the back is snoozed out. He's just, right, Z'd, right? And his eyes might even be open, but he's asleep. He's gone, right? Okay. This one over here is going, man, is this boring, right? This is like excruciating. He's looking at her, but he's like, oh, when am I going to have lunch? Am I going to go play football? You know, it's nothing having to do with the class, although he's looking right at you. This one's going, will you stop hitting me? Right? This kid going like this, and she can't even see that. So he's bothering him. And this one lifts his hand up and goes, hey, can I tell you about my brother? Wait, what? We're talking about English here. Where did the brother come from, right? Okay. So these are all going on in this classroom. Now the question for the teacher or the educator is what I call dissection. The job of the educator is to dissect the cause of what's happening here. Why is this kid bored? Why is this one sleeping? Why is this kid so distracted that only his interests are in the girl next door? And why is this one impulsively throwing out a comment which is completely off topic? Why? What is the why question? What's the cause of what's happening to them that's leading to these behaviors? Okay? And from dissection comes intervention. So here's the art of education. Dissect the cause of the lack of learning and design an intervention to address the learning challenge. Dissect, intervene. Those two have got to go together. Okay? So tonight, part of it is the dissection is around the social emotional processes. Okay? So I want to give you a quick little piece of advice, information, on brain development. This is going to be very, very simple brain. Don't worry, no neuroanatomy, I promise. Okay? But here's the simple idea. On the y-axis, or vertical, is brain development, how mature the system is. And on the x, or horizontal, is age, from birth to 23 to 25 years. Okay? Needless to say, there's a lot of brain development going on in utero, fetal development, right? But we're just going to start at birth. Okay? Has anybody here watched or liked Star Trek? Any Star Trek fans? Did you know what it is? Star Trek was a movie, it was a series, TV series about planetary exploration, okay? And in that show, and in the movies, if you've seen them, there were two key characters, and they're going to represent the graph, okay? The first was Captain Kirk. He was the head of the starship, of this little, spaceship. And he was kind of a normal human being. He had emotions and decision-making. So we're going to have him represent the emotional side of things. And the emotional side of things develops very quickly. So from birth, very quickly that system matures. And you can kind of see that here on top. Already by the age of 13, 14, you're getting some maturity. It continues for a while, but it matures quite quickly. In contrast to Captain Kirk was Dr. Spock, who was like a robot. He was all about rational decision-making, no emotions at all. There's this situation and that situation. What are the costs and benefits? We're going this way. No emotion. It's the thinking systems. And these develop very slowly. So they're not fully mature until individuals are between 23 to 25 years of age. Under typical development, when traumatic experiences or different kinds of disabilities occur, that curve can get stretched to much later. Now think about that. Anybody here under 25? Well, if you are, you're not there yet. Okay, and the bad news for us old people is that curve starts to go down as we get older. So I'm kind of hitting that downward curve. So you all probably have grandparents. They're turning into little kids with the executive system, which is memory, attention, self-regulation, and planning. They forget things. They throw tantrums if you're older. Things stress them out, right? I have a 93-year-old father. Sometimes he'll call me up, hyperventilating. What's wrong? I can't find my keys. It's not that big of a deal, But for him, it's a really big deal. Huge, right? Okay. So that's important because the emotional system's running the show for a way long period of time under typical conditions, okay? All right, that's the first piece I wanted to leave you with. The second is I want to share with you, and if there's a really important message for tonight, it's this slide. There are different causes of social emotional challenges. And tonight, it's 3 buckets, or 3 pushpins that are going to have different relationships to social emotional challenges. And the key idea is, when you see a social emotional challenge, you can't assume it's from one of these causes. It could be from one, it could be from all 3. So what are they? The first is disability. Things like neurodevelopmental disorders, and we'll fill in some of these in a moment. The second bucket, or pushpin, is trauma, traumatic experiences. And the third is mood. Okay? So disability, trauma, and mood. What do we mean by disability? Disability are classifications that are clinically labeled. They come from very specific criteria in one kind of manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that's often used in the United States and Canada and North America, or the Interclassification of Diseases. These are clinically verifiable, and they can only really be verified by people like psychiatrists, okay? There are particular assessments that are used with very specific criteria, and they work through these criteria. And if they check off a certain number of them, you are labeled as having one of these disabilities. So, for example, autism, okay, as an example. Some of these disabilities, unfortunately, have now become part of the common vocabulary, just like trauma has. So people will say, I'm autistic. Well, no, you don't get to label yourself as autistic. So it's common, and I don't know if this is certainly true in Kenya, but it's certainly true in the United States, that people say, oh, you know, I'm socially awkward, I'm autistic. Well, that's not the clinical definition of it. So there are real criteria, okay? Or I have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, because I put things away. No, that's not OCD, okay? Or, you know, I'm having difficulty with my romantic relationships. I have an attachment disorder. No. And it's gotten worse because on places like TikTok, there are things like hashtag bipolar, hashtag anxiety, and kids are now self-diagnosing. And that's a disaster, okay? So, but those are disability categories, and they are clinically verifiable. Okay. The second is trauma, and these are responses to adversity, such as abuse, neglect, and violence, that lead to a scarring of the body and brain. So trauma is the response. Abuse, neglect, violence are the experiences. And the reason why the response is an important part of this is because not everyone who experiences adversity responds with trauma. Some respond with resilience. Okay? What we care about here is trauma, because trauma is a scarring and often of the social emotional processes. And the third is mood. We all have moods. We come in and out of them. Okay? What can affect our mood? Stress, sleep. Okay? If those moods are stable, you're constantly ecstatic and happy, or you're constantly depressed, that becomes a disability. Right? Mood in this sense are things that come in and out. They flitter. We all have them. We're in a bad mood today. Okay? That doesn't mean you're depressed. You're angry because someone like me yesterday driving in Nairobi traffic, and the buses are going this way and the motorcycles are going this way, and I don't know where I'm going, and I'm angry. Okay? Bad mood, right? But I don't have a mood disorder. Okay? So that's important. Poor night's sleep, in a bad mood, or can't function, right? Okay. If that repeats itself, which in fact, one of the signs of trauma is poor sleep, then it becomes something else. Okay, so these are different causes. So when we see signs of social emotional challenges, we can't go to the cause. We have to figure that out. Dissection. Whether you're an educator or anyone else, if you're seeing some of the social emotional challenges, you need to understand the cause. And that's important for another reason, which is going to be key for all of you who are teachers or educators, and many of you I know are. In the case of disability, some of these things are not changeable. What's the job of a teacher? To change the mind. But you have to know what's changeable. Autism, as one example of what goes on with autism, is that already as babies, autistic babies are averse to looking at someone. What does a mother do when she's got a newborn, or a father? They hold them on their lap and they look into their eyes. That's about the most natural thing a parent ever does with a baby. And what does an autistic baby do? Look away. And if you try to teach that baby or force that baby to look at you because you say that's rude, you're hurting them, and it won't change. That's part of the disability. In the same way that for many autistic children, and many of you I know, it's a spectrum, right? A range of variation. A light touch, Kenyan, as a population, you're a very physical population. Many Americans are not. I will tell you a personal story. When I was living in Kenya in 1983, I lived for 2 years in Amboseli National Park, and I played on the local football team. And when I first got there, and one of my friends, my male friends, first held my hand to talk to me, I was like, what's that? But then I became very used to that, as a custom. And when I came back to Los Angeles as a grad student, I grabbed one of my male friends' hands. I was like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm sorry. Okay, very different customs, right? For an autistic child, that kind of light touch is perceived as pain, not as socially friendly. Different wiring of the brain, okay? So we need to understand that because some causes are changeable and some are not. In the case of traumatic experiences, many of those changes, depending on when they occurred and for how long, are changeable. Okay? So we as educators want to know what's changeable. Okay? So critically, 3 potential causes. They can be all present or one or more. Okay? Okay, so that's very, very quick on just some of the ideas around social emotional processes, and now I want to talk about strategies. Okay? All right, so let's talk about emotional awareness. When we think about emotions, of course, emotions are an internal thing that's happening to us that is often expressed externally. Okay? Here we have a whole variety of different emotions. But importantly, emotions aren't just an internal experience, they're external in that we perceive it in others, or we can perceive it in others. And they manifest not just in the face, but in the body. So emotional awareness has 2 critical components. Awareness of what's going on inside of us, the self, and what's going on in others. Okay? So let's think about that for a moment. Think about yourselves. Think about how aware you feel you are about your internal states and how sensitive you are to others' internal states. Okay? Remember CJ. Well, I kind of know what it's like to be me, but I don't really kind of know what it's like to be you, except, sort of roughly speaking. Okay? So here's a category of emotion which really gets at this, which is empathy. Any of you tell me what empathy is? What's empathy? Empathy. Anybody define empathy? Yeah.
Being aware of someone's emotions or state of being and wanting to help them.
And wanting to help them. Okay, good. So being aware of someone else's emotion and wanting to help them. Okay, good. Let me refine that just a little bit. Empathy, in the simplest sense, is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It's kind of knowing what it's like to be them, putting yourself in their perspective, even if you don't act on it. So notice what happened when I was describing CJ. My eyes watered up because I'm thinking about him. Okay? For me, empathy is very easily triggered. Okay? So empathy is a mirroring of emotion, and it's very different than sympathy. Sympathy is seeing someone joyful, sad, happy, and responding to them. Okay, so here you have 3 examples where in many people we empathize automatically. We see someone yawning, and for many of us, we want to yawn, and we get tired even. And here's something that's so interesting about this. Autism, psychopathy, no yawning in response to others yawning. Why? Because autism and psychopathy as part of the disability is low to no empathy. And that won't change. But here's something else. Children exposed to war and community violence have the empathy system knocked out. It kills the empathy system. Why is that important? Think of children in Gaza, Ukraine, children who here were exposed to the protest of losing loved ones, and now they're empathetic. Do you think they care about others? Can't care about others, your part, if you don't have empathy. Okay? So empathy is this critical mirroring. It's automatic in some of us. And the important part here is there are two parts to empathy. There's the automatic, unconscious part, where it just happens to you. Again, me talking about CJ, I didn't put the water tears on. They just happened, right? Unconsciously to me. I could feel them coming. Here they come. Automatic. There's also the conscious part. I see someone in pain, I go, you know what? I should do something caring for that individual. That's completely cognitive, okay? But very, very different, okay? It's the unconscious part that makes the kindness of the world go by. Okay. So let me give you some ideas, strategies. These are especially, I think, going to be helpful for those of you in the educational space. This is called the zones of regulation. And the idea is for individuals who have a hard time being aware of their own emotions, it's to link them to colors that give them an easy metric for where they are. Okay? So here I'm going to give you a sense here, and this is done in kind of cartoon fashion. I don't know if some of you have seen the insight. Yeah, oh yeah. So Natalie, you can pass these out. I've got some handouts for you so you can kind of have something to take home, and I think they'll be online for those of you who are online. These are kind of little worksheets, and I'm going to share with you in a moment kind of just ways of thinking about using them. Here I've obviously got images that are good for little kids from the movie Inside Out, but they could be any images that you please. But here's the basic idea, and I want to say this as you think about the students you work with. So we have the blue zone, which is feelings of sadness, tired, bored, or sick. The green zone, happy, focused, ready, calm. The yellow zone, worried, excited, wiggly, kind of moving around, silly. And the red zone, angry, mad, upset, disgusted. Obviously, we want students in the green zone. Green is go. Green is go, ready to learn. Okay? Well, but what does ready to learn mean? I'm kind of relatively happy. My body's focused, right? That's what we want. So the way this works, okay, and again, there's lots of ways to make it work, but I'll get you to sort of think about it and think about the students you have, is in the following way. You can give this to your students as a handout. And you say, I want you to tell me where you think you are. And then I will come by and indicate where I think you are. Okay? And then in classrooms, what's very nice is you have a board with blue, green, yellow, and red. And you have little markers for the students, and you put them on where they are. And the goal is to get to the green. And now the question is, of course, how? And this is where we're going to continue with our strategies. But this brings emotional awareness to them explicitly. And the reason why I want it to be something that's an image is because one thing that many of the disabilities and trauma and stress do is it hurts our short-term memory. If I'm a child living with traumatic experiences, abuse, my memory is clouded. I may not process what you're saying. So if I've got a visual here on my desk or up on the wall, I don't need my memory. I just see it. Oh my God, my teacher put me in the red zone. There's no memory for that. If I tell him, you're in the red zone, I'm going to forget that 2 seconds later. But I can see it. There's also a motivation to get out of the red because there are benefits for being in the green. Okay? So making that explicit can help bring awareness to the student so that their emotional sense becomes explicit. Okay? And again, how you articulate this is going to depend on the age of the student. Okay? For students who are very young, maybe you help them create their own little icon that can be glued on or taped up on the board so they have something that's personal. For older, it might be just something they have on their desk that they're checking off in intervals. Okay? So different ways of doing it, depending on the age of the student or the client. This takes it to another level, and it's what I'm going to call body awareness, but it's body awareness in terms of how the emotions are affecting at the body level. And before I show you this little checklist, the idea is this: both disability and trauma and stress can manifest themselves in the body. And for people with disability and trauma in particular, they may have lost any sense of what their body is doing. Their body is trying to tell them things, but they have become unaware of that because of the disability or because of the trauma or because of both. Okay? Some of you who were with us last week on trauma, you learned that some of the symptoms of traumatic experiences is you become completely unaware of what's going on inside your body because your autonomic system is not getting to your brain. It's not telling you things. You're not aware, okay? So this is a way of bringing greater awareness to the body. I'll give you an example before I even show you the checklist. I was working with a very young teacher, working in a school for children with social emotional challenges, and I was introducing her to a very large boy who she knew from hearing sounds had just been physically restrained because he was being very violent towards a teacher. So I was involved in the physical restraint along with 3 other teachers. Big kid. She knew that. New teacher. She walks up to the boy for me to introduce him and say, Mrs. Smith, this is John. And what's her body doing? This. Her fists are clenched. Now, what do you think a boy who's violent is going to do to seeing this? He wants to slug her. Like, she's in fighting stance? I'm just going to go out and hit you. So she was not aware of her body. And of course, she was stressed because she knew what just happened. I don't blame her. But she wasn't aware of this. So after we had the introduction, I said, did you know what your fists were doing? She says, no, what are you talking about? I said, you were like this. Unaware. Okay? She was stressed. She didn't have a disability and she didn't have trauma. She was stressed. Who wouldn't be? Okay? But it's being aware of that body, the tone of your voice, all these things. Okay? So this is a checklist, and it's a way of giving this to a student, which will bring awareness to what's going on when they're not aware. So here are just some items. I'm sorry this is a little small, so I'll just read it to you. Head hurting, right? My head hurts, right? Something's going on here. Eyes darting, looking around. Those of you who have been trained with aspects of childhood trauma, you know that abuse leads to children who feel unsafe. And if they feel unsafe, they're looking around for the escape route or someone they can hit or something else. They're vigilant. Okay? Noise hurts ears, hypersensitivity, hyperarousal to sounds. Fast breathing. They're talking to you. Can you get me? Heart racing, right? Heart is beating very, very fast. Noisy stomach, often a response to trauma, is problems with digestion, bowel problems. So that stomach is gurgling, I've got to go to the bathroom all the time, I don't understand why. And they're not aware of it. They're just going to the bathroom all the time, or they're having tummy problems. Okay? Body shaking. So they're talking to you, and everything's kind of shaking. They're nervous, they're afraid, for whatever reasons. Can't control it. Okay? Bouncing legs. Okay, so they're in class at the desk, and the leg is constantly going. Can't stop. Fidgeting, right? Including fidgeting hands. So they're sitting there and, this doesn't stop. Sweating. It's a cool Nairobi day, like now, and they're sweating talking to you. Why? You should have your jacket on, and you're sweating everywhere. Okay? Tense body, like that teacher. Okay? They're sitting here and they're tense. And from your perspective, nothing's going on. You're teaching the class. You're teaching them, and they're like this. Because for them, they're perceiving something that's unsafe. And you're not aware of that, and they're not aware that they're tense. Okay? No energy. Completely down. Head down on the desk. No energy. Lack of energy. Blue zone. Okay? So here's the idea. By giving them this checklist and saying, check these off, you're bringing greater awareness to the things that might change. And what you might imagine is that a child, a student, an older student, an adult who has poor body awareness wouldn't check anything off. And then you come up to them and you can say, during this class, your knees were bouncing up and down the entire time. Really? Yeah, really. And you now start bringing greater awareness to them. So here's the pattern. A student with poor body awareness won't check anything off. And as you work with them, they'll check more and more off. And as you give them strategies to calm the body down, they check off less and less because they're getting better. So that's the arc. From nothing checked off to something checked off to very little checked off. Because you've now given them coping strategies. Okay? So these are about emotional awareness and as they manifest themselves. And that's really important because disability, trauma, and mood manifest themselves in these ways. Okay? All right, self-regulation. Again, simple little graphic. The y-axis vertical is level of control, how much control you have over what's going on. And then the x or horizontal is time going on. Okay? So you have a high level of control or a low level of control. So here you are in a classroom, right? Whatever the classroom is. And the students seem calm. They're zen. They're relaxed. Body's relaxed. Everything looks good. And all of a sudden, somebody gets up maybe, or their face frowns. They look a little bit frustrated. Something triggered them, and they're now getting a little worried. Then they become agitated, right? In any way they might. And then that gets accelerated, and then it peaks, and they blow a fuse because there's no control left anymore. And then eventually they start to de-escalate, and they're recovering. The critical piece here is you don't want to work with your students when they're peaked because there's no capacity to learn here. So you want to catch students before they get peaked, and so do they, or you want to catch them on the other end. Because if you're trying to teach anything and a student has been triggered to the point where they're peaked, there will be no learning. Okay, so how can we help the individual, the student, cut things off before they get peaked? So let me give you a couple of strategies. The first one is what's often called the size of the problem. And this definitely works for any age. Here's the idea, and I'm going to ask you to, where's Natalie? Can we hand this second one out? So this is called the size of the problem, and what I'm going to ask you to do is, you don't have to write this down, but I'm going to ask you to kind of work through the activity with me, okay? Here's the basic idea. Imagine 3 boxes of different sizes, small, medium, and big. And what these boxes represent are problems in your life. Okay? Some problems are small. Some problems are medium-sized, and some problems are really big. Okay? And I want you to imagine for yourselves, because this is the exercise that you would have with your students, is you're going to write them down. You're actually going to write down what counts as a small, medium, and big problem. But of course, if I just left that as my explanation to my students, they'd be like, I don't get it. So as in any good instruction, you have to model it for the students. Give them some examples. So you might say, for me, a small problem would be, I'm kind of talking to you, and normally I don't sit in one place. I can't stop moving. I'm very movie. So I'm moving around, and all of a sudden I turn to the board, and I accidentally bang my foot against the wall, and it kind of hurts. That's a small problem. It's there, goes away, small problem. Big problem, one happened recently to me, I get a phone call from my father that my mother is in the hospital in a coma. Big problem, because they live in France and I live in the United States, and my mom is in a coma. Big problem. I might lose my mother. Big problem, big reaction too. Small problem, small reaction. So you put things in those boxes. Medium problem, I'm in Nairobi traffic, and you know what? I am not going to get here at 5:30. There is no way. But I also know that Kenyans are late for things. I'm like, relax. No problem. Small problem. So medium problems, big problems, small problems. But you model it from them. Say, now, for you, when they're in a calm state, right, not in that peak state, when they're calm, please write down some examples of what are small, medium, and big. And now you've got a metric that's explicit that you can refer to. Why is that important? Because in both disabilities and in trauma, there are often outsized reactions to the problems. So you've got sort of medium-sized reactions and big reactions, small ones, but for children and adults with disabilities and with trauma, the reaction is often large to small problems, right? Because they overreact. For those of you who are here for childhood trauma, or for those of you who take the class, a certificate course, I encourage you, that's what happens is you get out of balance. You have hyperreactions to things. So this scale provides an anchor. So when the student is having a reaction, you can show them this scale and say, wait, where are you on this? This is the problem. You indicated that if you didn't do well in the exam, that was kind of a medium problem. Are you having a medium reaction? Or is it a big reaction? So now you are giving them a kind of a calibration. And again, you did it when they were calm. Imagine doing it when they're peaked. Everything is going to be big problems. That's why you have to do it when they're calm. Okay? So this is to calibrate problem size with reaction size to bring those into alignment. It is perfectly natural to have a massive response to losing a parent. That is the reaction one expects. It is not reasonable to have a big reaction to stubbing your toe. Okay, second strategy for self-regulation. It is common in schools, and I would say in businesses and almost everywhere else, that if people want to attain their goals, it's by willpower. So you may have these up in your offices. Here are common posters. Constantly push yourself higher and harder until you reach your goals. Stop saying I wish and start saying I will, as if that's going to do it. This is nonsense. It doesn't do anything except go, oh well, I guess I don't have any willpower. The reality is, and this is based on hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers, people who you know in your life who look like they have good self-regulation, good self-control, actually don't have good self-control, they have good habits, so they don't need self-control. Let me say that again. People who look like they're really efficient and under control all the time don't have better self-control, they have better habits. They're really efficient at habit formation. So I want to tell you a strategy for creating habits of mind. Because if they're habits of mind, they're effectively unconscious. And here's a way to think about that. These are called implementation intentions, and I'm going to tell you why they work. And I'm going to give you an example with my wife, who's sitting in the audience. We had an absolutely lovely cat whose name was Jojo. And Jojo liked to come into our bedroom and sleep on our bed. And we enjoyed that very much. But sometimes he would come into our bed and we would forget when we'd leave and we would close the door. And what did Jojo do? He peed on our bed. Not nice. So here's what we did. We built a little habit of mind. And the habit of mind went like this. If Jojo is on our bed, then leave the door open. And we repeated it to ourselves every day until it became a habit. And very quickly, we never closed that door when Jojo was in the room. So here's the idea. Implementation intentions are if-then phrases. If sets up the situation, effectively the problem, okay, of the situation. What occurs, when, and how? Then is the action. What do you do? How do I respond in this situation? So if the situation occurs, then I do this. If then just becomes an association. And when you repeat it over and over and over again, it becomes an unconscious habit. In other words, you're no longer thinking. For a very long time, I bit my nails terribly. It was the one domain I had very little self-control over. And it was like ugly, not nice. Mine was, if my finger goes in my mouth, then I pull it out. Okay. Here's some ways of thinking about this. And the key is repetition. Repetition, repetition, repetition. So it becomes a mantra. Okay? Let me give you 3 examples relevant to tonight. If I am socially anxious, common situation, right? Then spell out the reasons why. It is well established that when people actually spell out, and I mean literally write out, they often realize that the reasons are silly. They don't make sense. If I'm anxious about an exam, then write out why. You say, I don't feel like I've studied hard enough. And you're like, I've studied really hard. That example I just gave you was done in a class of 1,000 students at the University of Chicago, where some students had to write if-then statements out and write out the reasons why they were nervous explicitly, and the other half of the class did nothing. The students who spelled out their reason scored a full grade higher than those who didn't anything. Because they're like, well, this makes no sense. I have no reason to be anxious. But they repeated this to them. So it became a habit. They could call it up when they needed it. Okay? Second example, if I'm frustrated, right? Something that happens to students all the time. Then do 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out of breathing to calm the system down. I'm frustrated. Why does this work? Again, as a habit. You can't practice this when you're frustrated. You need to practice the breathing when you're not frustrated so that the habit kicks into gear unconsciously. You don't want that in-out breathing to be go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. That will not work. All of a sudden you're frustrated and you go, and it's completely unconscious. You're just kicking into gear unconsciously. The if-then triggers it unconsciously. Third example, if approaching someone who's familiar, then friendly greeting. For many people, that's not an automatic thing because of the disability or because of the trauma. But make it a mantra, unconscious. If I approach, hey, how you doing? Because the then just went, boom, it just triggered it in me. I didn't think about it. There's no more thinking. There's no more willpower. It doesn't exist. This has been used to show that you can improve grades in school. If I have an exam in 1 week, then I spend an hour studying every day. It helps with ADHD, attention issues. It helps us with weight loss. It helps with many, many different things because it taps into the unconscious habit formation. Okay? So it basically gets around the self-control problem by creating a habit. Okay? So those are some strategies for self-regulation. Perspective taking. I want you all I'll cue you of go. You don't actually need to do this. This will work fine. For those of you online, here's the key thing. You're going to see an image pop up on the screen, and I want you to put in your head the first thing you see. Okay? The first thing. Not the second or third or fourth. The first thing that comes into your mind. Okay? Everybody ready? Look up on the screen. Here we go. First thing. All right, call out. What did you see? A young lady. Anybody else? An old lady. All right, who saw the old lady? You saw the old lady? Okay. The people who saw the old lady, do you see the young lady? No. Can you show where the young lady is? Can you just show how you see the young lady? Exactly. Okay? So this is what's called an ambiguous figure. And the perspective is, depending on where you're looking, you'll see one or the other. Here's the really interesting thing. Until the age of about 4, children will see one and they can't flip-flop spontaneously. Now that you know the trick, you can flip-flop it at will. You can take either perspective. She's either young or she's old. She's actually both, because there's two things going on here. Okay? That's perspective taking in one sense. Okay? But the interesting thing is this. For some disabilities and some aspects of traumatic experiences, there can be great rigidity of not being able to take perspective. Autism is an example of that. Various kinds of traumatic experiences are examples of rigidity, where they only see things one way. Okay? Perseveration is something where you keep doing the same thing over and over again. OCD is an example of that. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is this massive repetition, right? And for many of you who might know about this, OCD is obsessively repeating things. It often starts with health issues of repeatedly washing the hands until you start bleeding. It becomes so bad. And then it migrates into personalized things. Someone who I know well, the OCD manifested in the way that whenever they went through a door frame, they had to do it 13 times. Exactly 13. Not 12, not 14, 13. If you stopped her at 12, she would do it one more time. That's that kind of perseveration, repetition, okay? In autism, you get what's often called echolalia. Well, they'll echo back multiple times what you say, okay? Experience can be a limitation on perspective. You've just never been opened up to an alternative way of thinking about anything, okay? Or you're impulsive. It's not you can't see alternatives, you just respond, oh, old lady, because you've never stopped to see the young lady. So these are different routes into perspective taking. So now I want to share with you a couple of things and give you another activity. The key idea here is when people struggle for whatever social emotional reasons, it's typically not because they want to fail or act in inappropriate ways, but because they lack the skills to be successful. This is the ultimate lens for an educator. Don't look at it as you are doing the wrong or inappropriate thing, but you are missing the skills to do it in the right, correct, appropriate way. So how am I going to give you those skills? Perspective, okay? So don't let them put that round circle and square peg over and over and over again. Intervene. All right, so the idea here is called collaborative problem solving. And it's called collaborative because you're working together with a student. And it's problem solving because you are problem solving with them about alternative perspectives. Okay, here's the idea. You have a worksheet. Natalie, can I get you to do the third worksheet? So this is a roadmap you can use. There are lots of ways to articulate it, but it's a sheet that I would encourage you, if you're interested, to photocopy many copies, and you can use it with your students of whatever age they are. This, again, is kind of universal in terms of the age and culture. It's kind of culturally independent, although how it's mapped out, you'll see in a moment, can be slightly different. So the first thing you are doing, and I'm going to ask you to imagine now students you work with, and there is some problem that has been identified, something that is kind of not working well for the student in some way, something that's just not working that maybe they've identified or maybe you've identified and shared with them. So the first thing is going to be to articulate just the facts. You're not asking for their opinions, just what's the problem? Just define that. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is, why did this problem happen? Now you're asking the student in this case, why do you think this happened? And they'll give you their explanation. Okay? Step three, how did you respond to that problem? What was your response to when the problem occurred? And four is I want you to think about the outcomes of your response that are both positive and negative. And remember, in this case, you're not defining what's positive and negative. You're asking them for what they thought was a good thing and what was a bad thing. And you might have to kind of nudge them a little bit to think about not just only positive and negative for you, but for the others, because this is a social situation. Okay? All right, now you've gotten that information. And as we talk about this a little bit more, you'll see there may have to be more questioning on your part to get them to talk. Of course, that's going to depend on your relationship, who they are, their level of communication expression. So lots of things will make this different, okay? All right, now at this point comes the critical collaboration part. You're going to go through that with them. But now you're going to ask them, can we think of an alternative response to the problem? And maybe they can, maybe they can't. So you might have to give them an example. Here's an alternative response. How do you think that might turn out, both positively and negatively for you? And then one more round. How about a second alternative? And how might that turn out? Okay? So let me fill this out for you, right? Let's imagine that the problem is I was really bothered and I just hit this boy next to me. I hit somebody. That's the problem, right? He bothered me. He said something about me that bothered me, and I hit him, right? The problem is he said something mean about me, okay? Why did it happen? It happened because he said something mean about me. That's why it happened. How did you respond? I hit him. Again, you haven't made any commentary on this. What are the positive outcomes? I hit him. He won't do that again. Negative? I don't really see any negatives. All good for me. So you might then say, well, how do you think James felt getting hit? I don't know. I don't care. Well, you know, I don't know. Getting hit usually doesn't feel good. How have you felt when you got hit? Oh, not very good. Okay. So, you think we can call that a negative? Yeah, okay, maybe. What else could you have done besides hit him when he said something mean? I have no idea. The only way to stop people from doing things that are mean is hit them. Do you think you could have come to me, the teacher, and said, he said something mean to me? Well, what would that do? Let's imagine what that would do. What might I do as a teacher if someone came to me and said that someone was saying something mean? What might I do? Maybe you'd hit them. No, I don't hit people. But I might discipline them. I might ask them to do something as a consequence, and I certainly would tell them that's not appropriate and work with them to not say mean things. Okay? So you work through with them this collaboration. And then hopefully they see that some of these alternatives are a better way. And now, if you turn the paper over, there's the action plan. And the action plan is you're stating the problem, and in this case, the problem is someone says something mean to me. My response is I go to my teacher and tell them, and the expected outcome is they stop saying mean things to me. And now they have something explicit as an alternative perspective to manage the problem. And it's a collaboration. And it's a collaboration in an important way because rather than saying, what you did was bad and wrong, and you should never do that again, which may all be true, but that is not a collaboration. And that's not going to get that child to see an alternative. But this will, because you've invited them into the collaboration to problem solve. Okay? All right, last step. Critical thinking strategies. So I'm going to get you to get your critical thinking minds on, and I'm going to give you 2 problems. Everybody ready? First problem, my favorite sport. Some of you may have noticed I have an ankle brace on because my ankle got broken by a goalie playing football. Here's my problem for you. Ready? Okay. The total cost of football boots and a used ball is 1,010 Kenyan shillings. The boots cost 1,000 Kenyan shillings more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? People in the chat should write their answers in the chat. Anybody have an answer for me? How much? How much is the ball? 9 shillings? Okay, 9 shillings. Anybody answers? 10 shillings? Anybody else? 10. The answer is not 9, and it's not 10. And you're probably wondering, how dumb can I be? Well, let me tell you, you are not dumb. You are in a majority. 80% of people, irrespective of their level of education, get this problem wrong. Anybody want to take another guess? Yeah. So it has nothing to do with the used ball. It's math. It's simple math. But I trapped you. I'll tell you for time. The ball costs 5 shillings, and the boots cost 1,005. And let me tell you why 10 is wrong. If it's 10 shillings, and remember, how much more are the boots? 1,000. What's 1,000 plus 10? If it's 1,000 more, how much does the boots have to be? 1,010 shillings. Because 1,010 minus 10 is 1,000. So the boots, if they're 10 shillings, 1,010 plus 10 is what? How much is the total? That's the wrong answer. But 1,005 shillings for the boots and 5 shillings for the ball is 1,010 shillings. Why did you get trapped? And by the way, I'm going to show you how not dumb you are. My father has a PhD in physics. He got this wrong. And I used it because he's saying, so what are you doing these days? I said, I'm working on kind of cognitive biases. He goes, that's not even science. I'm like, I give him the problem. Well, yeah, of course it's 10. I'm like, of course you're wrong. Because you just think, well, of course it's 10. I trapped you into thinking quickly. Slow down. Next problem. Health question. Is it healthy to drink milk? Yeah? 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 What kind of milk? Did I say that? Does it depend on your own health? What if you're obese? What if you have problems with lactose intolerance? Healthy? What if it's almond milk? Skim milk? Diet milk? You all made a lot of assumptions in answering that question, and what you should have said back to me is, Mark, what do you mean by healthy, and what do you mean by milk? That was the right answer, by the way. More questions. Okay. So that's not typically what we do because we just answer. And that's the common response. We want to teach people to slow down. So let me give you a couple strategies. Let's take these 2 problems, and this is what I call them all are slow down prompts. So Natalie, if you can actually pass out next set. So I'm going to leave you with these goodies. But here's the first. Natalie, you have those last ones? Good, okay. So these are slow down prompts. They ultimately lead to slowing the mind down. And here's the first one. It's what I call confidence. It's the confidence prompt. Imagine I had asked you these questions, and I said, before you give me the answer, here's what you're going to do. If you are absolutely confident that you have the right answer, put 2 thumbs up. If you're pretty confident, put 1 thumb up. And if either you don't know or you're unsure, put 1 up and 1 down. And the reason for this last one is because no student will say, I have no idea. I am like so lost, they're never going to give you this one. But this is, I'm not sure or I don't know. Okay, so it's this way. Now, before you call on anybody, you wait until everybody raises their hand. Here's the magic, and you will see this if you use this. The kid who goes like this looks around the room and goes, oh, I'm the only one? Maybe I'm a 1. Or, maybe I'm this. I don't know. And they start revising and rethinking the answer because there's now a social thing going on. And there's no way in a classroom everybody's going to do this. Maybe except if you have a class of 18-year-olds and say, 2 plus 2. Let's hope they all go like this. I know the answer to that question, right? Okay, so this slows people down. And in studies that have used exactly these problems, you get less 10-shilling answers. Because they think, maybe something's fishy about this question. Right? Okay. So that's the confidence problem. Let me give you 2 other ones. The second one is what I call know it. And here again, just like the first one, you're going to ask the students to respond at all before you ask them the answer. So you're going to give them a question, and I'm going to give you an example of this in a moment. And if they know the answer, they put 1 finger up. If they know the answer and they can explain why it's the answer, they put 2 fingers up. And if they know the answer, can explain it, and give an example or an illustration, they put 3. Now notice, number 3 is the really rich answer. That's what we hope every student can give. Okay? Some kids will just give an answer, and maybe it's the wrong answer, maybe it's the right answer, but it's at the surface level. They may not even know why it's the answer. Okay? So let me give you an example. Is it healthy for teenagers to use social media? You could just say yes or no. But can you give me a reason why it's yes or no? And can you illustrate it by an example of why it's either good or bad? That's very different. So let's try. Is it healthy for teenagers to use social media? I will wait till you all have your hands up. 1, 2, or 3. Come on, gotta do it. 3, got a 3, some 3s, good. No one's playing the game. I'm still waiting on fingers. Come on, give me the fingers. We got a lot of 3s, so 1, okay. 2, good, some 3s. All right, give me your 3.
All right. So for the first point, no, for me, I'd say that. Number 2, because I feel like at that point, their brain has not yet matured. So there's some emotional maturity that is not yet there that may make them easier to manipulate online by strangers. The third example would be something I'd seen on social media about a year ago, if I'm not wrong, where, was it a documentary? I think it was a documentary. You find that young girls living in slums, I don't know the politically correct word, but living in slums were being taken advantage of by men. By that, they've been solicited and they've been given small money. So you either send sexual photos or videos and eventually you get paid. So that's why
Very good. Good. So notice what's happened now. With a 3, you've got a rich format for discussion. Because now somebody can be, no, I don't agree with that. I'm a no, but I have 3 no, I'm a no. So you can get an entire discussion going where they can pick apart, well, what's your evidence for that? And you go deeper. Whereas if you just say, who thinks no and who thinks yes, we're kind of done. Right? Okay. So this slows everything down. Some of you, I could see the wheels were turning before you were raising your hand. That's exactly what we want. Okay. Third one. This is called what I call mind debate, and this requires a little writing, but it doesn't have to for children who may not be writing things down yet, is I'm going to give them a question like the one we just had, and you're going to write down the first answer that comes to mind. Okay? No, it's bad, right? And now I want you to write down a different answer. Yes, maybe it's good. And now you debate inside your head the 2 answers. And once you've debated and come up with which one you think is the right answer for you, now you raise your hand. And what I'm going to do is say, what were your 2 ideas? And why did you land on one versus the other? I just slowed them down. They had no alternative because I'm not calling on them until they have 2. At least 2. I just force them to slow down. They have no alternative. They got to play my game, not theirs. Okay? So these are all mechanisms to slow children down who are impulsive. Needless to say, and here's the beauty of this, I think, in all these cases, for those who might be teaching with children who may have disabilities within the classroom, you don't ever want to single anybody out and say, oh, this is for you because you have a disability. That's awful. These are strategies that can work with everyone. Fully functioning adult PhDs. Doesn't matter who they are, right? This works. So you don't have to single anybody out. It works to slow everybody down. Okay? All right, so we are at the end. So here's what I've done, and then we will open it up to questions. What I try to do for you today, and I'm just going to give you the highlights of pieces, is that there are many different social emotional processes, and when challenges arise, they can come from these three buckets that I described for you: disability, trauma, and mood. We then turn to thinking about emotional awareness, and I gave you some strategies for thinking about the internal emotions and the recognition of externalized emotions and how one can come to be more aware of those components. We then talked about self-regulation, and in particular, how to come to grips with dysregulation, where often the response is a misalignment between the size of the problem and the size of the reaction. We then talked about perspective taking and things that can lead to rigidity, and I gave you the example of collaborative problem solving. And then we just ended with critical thinking strategies designed to calm the mind, bring the patient mind into power so that it can think through things. So that's the summary. I hope these are some effective strategies for you, and I now turn to you with questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marc. That was a really powerful session. And I'm just wondering from the audience, do we have any questions coming up? I'll just hand over this mic right to you.
Hello, Dr. Marc. My name's Amran. I had a question regarding, you mentioned a very valid point about when during regulation or when emotions are really high in that table that you showed, that when a student is at the peak level, there's no learning happening. Can you give us some practical tips on how, I mean, you mentioned that it's best to catch it before the child gets to that level of peaked emotion. What are some practical tips if it gets to that point to re-regulate the child again?
Yeah, so some of the things that came up a little bit later are good ones. So for example, the breathing technique can be very effective. And I would say if you remember that curve, when things got to be accelerated, that's where breathing is unlikely to kick in, even if it's become a habit, because they're already moving too quickly up to the peak position. That will be likely, and this is where the sensitivity of the educator, and I'll use this in the broadest of sense, of recognizing the body signs. So I'll just give you an example. This is a child, a young man actually, about 16 years old, with autism, who was in a musical class of drumming, and there were a couple kids who were intentionally drumming badly, and I could tell this was starting to happen. So he was tapping his knee, and he was moving around, looking around, and at that point, I went over to him and said, "Robert, would you like to take a walk with me?" So I pulled him out of the class. I said, "What would be helpful for you right now?" "I have no idea." I said, "Let's just go over here and you can take a seat." And I said, "Would you like to work with some clay or color as a form of distraction and calming? Get your head onto something else. Get your mind onto something else." So sometimes, depending on where you catch the individual, it's moving them on to something else. Lots of variation with kids. Sometimes I will do as a teacher something completely ridiculous to make the kids laugh. Like I might fall on the ground. Like just completely unexpected. Get on a table and stand up and go, "Whoa!" Because it just completely takes them out of wherever they were. And it works with some kids. If they're on that accelerated level, the removing from the situation is often going to be the best strategy because you've got to get them out before it goes to peak. But in those earlier stages, it's giving them things like, hey, would you like to do some coloring? Or maybe you just like to put your head down. It's giving them suggestions to cool things down. Depending on the student, depending on the situation, there are many alternatives. Write down what's bothering you. Right? Again, making it explicit can often make it less intense. Okay? So those are some just basic ideas, right? If it's a student who has the if-then mantra, if you can remind them, if, and that may be sufficient for the trigger, okay? So in a very different kind of example, a child I was working with who had very poor personal boundaries, and his if-then was, if I approach somebody, he would often get so excited because he had a very significant attachment disorder, he would get very, very close to people, so it would invade the personal space very quickly. His if-then was, if I approach somebody, arm's length. And so I could see this little boy coming to me, and I said, Ryan, if? He goes, I know. Exactly. He stopped like that on a dime. Okay? So he was already very dysregulated. He was already on the acceleration because he was so excited to come and get in my face. But that if-then worked, again, for him because he had already built the habit. So, importantly, with students who have challenges of dysregulation, remember the key point I made. It's not teaching them self-control. It's teaching them habit so they don't need self-control. And that's what the if-then does. It bypasses the need. So that can kick into gear, but if-thens will not work at the accelerated level because the mind's gone, right? They're just not there anymore. They're just into that curve. And then you're going to have to deal with the consequences of going to peak. Again, unless you can move them out of the space and say, hey, come on with me. I got an idea. Let's go play basketball. Let's go do whatever. Anything. Or some of these acting jobs like that I like to do, which makes them completely distracted and think I'm a lunatic. And that's okay. I am in that moment.
My name is Mwende. So number one is to thank you for the techniques because, again, these are techniques you can use with young clients. So my question was, because I think I was reflecting back when I was in school, a Kenyan school, public school. So would you say these techniques are effective for like big classrooms? By that I mean like a lot of students, and I honestly feel like most of our teachers back then and even now were probably overwhelmed. Let's say students, around 50 to 60 students in a class or even more. So would you say they're effective for that kind of size of classrooms, and especially for our teachers who I don't think have gone through this kind of training? Yeah, I think that's the question basically.
Yeah, so that's an important question. So a couple of different answers to that. So one is, and I think this is really in some ways part of the mission for Shamiri, is that teachers absolutely need this kind of training. And in some ways, this class and the certificate are in some ways, in some sense, designed for teachers. But it ought to become part of the curriculum for teacher education and teacher training, right? It should be part of what it means to be a teacher. You don't get certified unless you have this kind of training. In the dream world, that's the reality. Okay. The second part of your question is equally important, which is that even if it's part of the training, if I have 50 children, what's feasible? I'm just going to give a couple thoughts about this, okay? One is that these kind of strategies have to become part of the curriculum. They're not reactions to what's happening in the moment, because that will definitely not work with 50 kids. But imagine if the zones of regulation is just part of my classroom. I can have 50 kids' names up on a board. No problem, right? And at the beginning of the day, I just say, where are all of you? And maybe each person's got a little sticker, and they put it where they are. 50 kids? Fine. 15 minutes, I'm done. And it brings greater awareness. Imagine if that body awareness circle was given to each child every day. It's part of their classwork. I don't care what your history is. This is what we do. We are getting you to be more aware of your bodies. I mean, I assume, like everywhere else, there's always health curriculum, health and hygiene. This should be part of it. So now you have it's part of the curriculum. It becomes part for everyone. Because ultimately these things are good for everyone. People will have delays in emotional awareness and body awareness for lots of reasons. And you just got 3 different categories for why. Okay? This can be part of the curriculum. And that makes it manageable because it's like teaching math. I'm teaching math to 50 kids. I teach social emotional things to 50 kids. Okay? But that has to become part of the thinking among educators, among mental health practitioners. It's a collaboration, right? So rather than having, you think, well, I got trained as a teacher or I got trained as a mental health practice, a psychologist or a counselor, some of the pieces that go into mental health have to come into education, and some of the pieces that go into education have to come into mental health. Two-way street.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Wangoi Maina. I come from Finding Me community. So thank you so much, Dr. Marc, for the insightful session. My question to you is for the strategies that you've shared for the social, emotional challenges, especially when it comes to kids who have a traumatic response to adverse experiences. When these strategies are practiced long enough, does it help them with their traumatic response? Can it help them build a resilience response to their to adverse experiences, if I may put it that way? And then now for the second question is, there's a graph that you showed us at the beginning of your presentation where you showed us how thinking and emotional systems develop. Now, if especially you're working with kids who are under the age of 13, will these strategies help them develop now their thinking and emotional systems like every other person, or will it still have a lag phase in it? I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
The question is really important, and it's important for people to understand. So many of the strategies that I showed you tonight are not designed to eliminate the memory of the traumatic experiences. That is what typically counseling, psychology, therapy is designed to do. But even counseling, psychology, and therapy is not designed to get rid of the memory, because that's not possible, but to think about it in a different way. So for those of you who did have the Masterclass last week, or have taken maybe even the certificate course or other experiences, you know well that a common response to sexual abuse and physical abuse is shame. Strong emotion. And shame comes from feeling that you've been victimized. And for many children who have been physically abused and sexually abused, the thought goes something like this. These are my parents, and they've abused me. There must be something wrong with me. I must be bad, or I must be strange, or there's just something wrong with me. God, there's something wrong with me. And now they feel useless. They have no self-worth. So the work has to be with dealing with those thoughts and emotions. These strategies are designed to, in some ways, help with greater emotional awareness and greater regulation. They're not designed to find different ways of thinking about. But some of those critical thinking strategies are designed to slow the brain down so that you can think about them better, right? A person who is depressed thinks they can't think clearly. Because whatever they start thinking, all they can think about is how sad they feel all the time, right? People are doing all these nice things for me and I still feel sad. What's wrong with me, right? So these are designed to get them out of those kinds of thought loops, right? If I'm feeling sad, then I go take a walk or I do something that's for me, that I know I feel good about, okay? So that's what they can do. And can they work for younger children? Absolutely. Okay, I don't know in the last 15 years, how many children I've worked with, but they help. CJ is no longer someone who flips his decks when he's frustrated. He doesn't do that. He hasn't done that in 5 years. He has learned coping mechanisms for emotional dysregulation. He has grown tremendously. And there's countless stories like that. Okay? Now, let me put one caveat. As some of you heard last time, much of the issue around trauma and the response depends on when it occurred, for how long, and how severe it was. Sometimes those experiences are so prolonged and so severe they lead to what's called complex PTSD, a different diagnosis than PTSD in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Those turn out to be very difficult to recover from. Not impossible, but much more difficult. In fact, for those of you who are interested in kind of the new wave of work in this area, in the United States especially, and in the UK, people are looking at treatment-resistant individuals with complex PTSD that are using therapy-assisted psychedelics, okay? Because they're treatment-resistant with the typical treatments. These are people who have experienced trauma from a very early age and have carried it through to them into adulthood. So, no miracles tonight. No one shoe fits all, okay? These are complicated situations, but there is great hope in the childhood years. Great hope.
Okay, thank you. There is great hope. Thank you. I will echo that. So we have a few questions from our online audience. I think you already started hinting at the first question when you talked about use of clay. Prudence is asking, can art therapy be combined with these strategies for children below the age of 10?
Yes, various kinds of therapeutic approaches can be applied to children under the age of 10. And this happens, at least in the United States, all the time in the schools where I work, and I assume for many of you, maybe similarly. There are different therapeutic approaches. And one thing that's maybe very relevant here is there's been a movement within the United States to add a diagnosis to the DSM called developmental trauma disorder, or DTD. And the reason for this is the following, and this is maybe very different than in Kenya. In the United States, services for treatment of mental health are only given by insurance if there's been a clinical diagnosis. So a child comes in, is seen by a psychiatrist for what is being claimed, let's say, by teachers, and the psychiatrist goes through their checklist or inventory of clinical diagnoses, PTSD, depression, anxiety, or whatever it is, and if it meets the criteria, that psychiatrist signs off on that, and that justifies treatment in terms of insurance and all the things that follow from that. If they don't, services don't follow. Here's what's interesting. This is very relevant to the question about 10 years old. Many children do not show the symptoms of PTSD, which was defined based on adults. They show different symptoms. Why? Because they're little kids. But they respond with a scarring that is a clear indication of the adversity they experienced. So just long story short, there's been a group of psychiatrists and psychologists in the United States who've been trying to push the DTD, developmental trauma disorder, into the DSM so that these kids get the services they need. That has not happened yet, okay? But the key point is that awareness of the symptoms allows for therapeutic approach, including cognitive behavioral therapy, DTD, and many other types of therapeutic approaches, along with many of the strategies that I shared with you tonight, so that children can be treated.
Thank you for that. The second question is from PC. And the question is, at what point can I refer the student for further support?
The question is, at what point can I refer?
Yes, at what point can I refer the student for further support? I guess this is in the context of a teacher who's observing this in the classroom.
So I am not sufficiently familiar with the Kenyan system to be able to say that to the context, but let me give you some ideas that come from my own experience directly. In the United States, when there continue to be repeated behavioral situations that arise in the classroom, aggression, completely failure to follow directions, continued poor performance in terms of what's going on, signs of any kind of physical injury. Any kind of signs of physical injury are automatically indications to a teacher to report. Any signs of significant neglect, a child continues to come in with poor hygiene, insufficient clothing, is sufficient criteria to report, and that is reporting to Child and Family Services. Okay, so those kinds of situations of neglect or abuse are automatic. You don't need any more evidence than the signs, physical injury or neglect. When it comes to other kinds of things like behavioral symptoms, like repeatedly blurting out answers, can't control themselves, when that becomes repetitive in the United States, those become the kind of cases where referrals begin to happen, where they refer them either to having someone come and work within the classroom or referred to a school that deals with children with special needs. Okay? There's no absolute here. If it happens 10 times, then we get referred. But when it raises to a level where it's so disruptive to the classroom environment, that's when referrals start to happen, with the exception being cases of neglect and abuse. Maltreatment.
Okay, thank you for that. The last one is, if possible, this is a fun one. If possible, could you kindly repeat the explanation of the ball question? This is from the house.
The ball question. Okay, so here's the idea. The shoes in the ball cost 1,010 shillings. The shoes cost 1,000 shillings more than the ball. So it's an addition problem, right? So if your answer is the ball costs 10 shillings, if the shoes are 1,000 shillings more, that means the shoes are 1,010 shillings, because 1,010 minus 10 is exactly 1,000. So that works, right? But if the shoes are 1,010 and the ball is 10, what is 1,010 plus 10? 1,020. That's the wrong sum. Therefore, the ball must be 5 shillings and the boots must be 1,005. Because 1,005 plus 5 is 1,010, and 1,005 minus 5 is 1,000. Very simple math. And don't feel bad. You're in good company.
Okay, so we have finally come to the end. That's all for the questions. Thank you very much for taking us on that journey from CJ's story to the pace of brain development, the causes of socio-emotional challenges. So by the time we are leaving, we know the answer to the question, what actually causes these socio-emotional challenges, and then practical strategies that we can actually use as soon as tomorrow when you go back to the classroom. So thank you very much.